June 1944, a hospital ship anchored off the coast of Normandy. Men are dying by the thousands. Tens of thousands more are missing limbs. And the only thing standing between them and fatal infection is a drug that had never been fully tested on humans at scale. Today, we're talking about antibiotics, specifically how penicillin went from a contaminated petri dish to a D-Day miracle, how it reshaped the math of who survives war, and why one author argues this discovery is part of a much darker pattern in scientific history. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why antibiotics aren't just a medical story. They're a story about how paradigm-shifting knowledge can simultaneously save the world and break it. My guest today has been deep in this material, and I want to start right at that hospital ship. What was actually happening there?
So the scene off Normandy is really the culmination of about 16 years of scientific work, right? Fleming makes his accidental discovery in 1928. He's a Scottish bacteriologist. He notices that a contaminating mold has inhibited the growth of Staphylococcus bacteria on a culture plate. He names the substance penicillin. But here's the thing, he can't purify it, he can't produce it in any useful quantity, and it just sits there, a laboratory curiosity for nearly a decade.
A decade? That's wild. So the discovery just kind of languishes?
Essentially, yes. It takes until 1939 for the real development to begin, and that happens at the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology at Oxford. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain lead a multidisciplinary team, Norman Heatley, Margaret Jennings, others, and they figure out how to cultivate the mold, extract and purify penicillin, and actually test its potency. By 1940 and 1941, they've demonstrated it works extraordinarily well in animals, and then they run the first successful human trials.
And what were they treating in those trials?
Severe bacterial infections, gas gangrene, pneumonia, conditions that had previously been essentially death sentences. And penicillin proved non-toxic and capable of treating them. That's when everyone realizes this is not just interesting science. This is a weapon.
And then the war accelerates everything.
Completely. World War II creates this urgent industrial demand. The U.S. Department of Agriculture and private industry collaborate to scale up production. And there's this fascinating moment at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory where a researcher named Miloslav Demarek uses X-rays to induce mutations in penicillium strains. He tests 5,000 variants. 5,000! And his team finds strains that produce double the yield of penicillin.
Wait, 5,000 variants? That's an almost absurd level of trial and error.
It really is. And those strains get further improved at the University of Wisconsin, which enables rapid, large-scale production. So by D-Day in June 1944, more than 2 million doses of penicillin had been manufactured for Allied forces. 2 million doses. That's the number that makes the hospital ship story possible.
So when those ships are anchored off Normandy, they're carrying something that didn't exist in any practical sense 15 years earlier.
Exactly. And the source material frames it this way. It's described as the first large-scale use of the drug in humans during a major amphibious assault. The drug's ability to prevent sepsis and gangrene transformed wartime medicine in real time. Soldiers with shrapnel wounds, burns, compound fractures, injuries that in World War I often led to fatal infections, now had dramatically improved survival prospects.
And there's also this detail about aerosolized penicillin that I found really interesting. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so Harold Abramson, working at Mount Sinai Hospital, pioneered the first aerosolized penicillin delivery in 1941. This allowed medics to administer penicillin directly to infected tissue, spray it right onto the wound. That technique was later refined through the Cold Spring Harbor Aerosolizer Project, which was funded by the War Department. So aboard those hospital ships, medics had both aerosolized and injectable penicillin at their disposal.
That's a detail that doesn't get talked about enough. We always hear about the pill or the injection, but the idea of spraying it directly onto a wound, that's almost intuitive when you think about it.
It really is. And it speaks to how rapidly the science was being adapted under pressure. War has this brutal way of accelerating innovation.
Okay, so let's zoom out a little because I think the numbers across the 3 major 20th century conflicts really tell the story of what antibiotics actually did. Walk me through that shift.
So this is where the data gets genuinely striking. In World War I, there are no antibiotics. Soldiers are living in trenches filled with mud, rats, lice, contaminated water. Diseases like trench fever, dysentery, typhoid, and influenza are ravaging armies. And in some campaigns, disease caused more deaths than actual combat. The 1918 influenza pandemic alone killed millions worldwide, including enormous numbers of soldiers.
So in WW1, you're almost as likely to die from an infection as from a bullet.
In some campaigns, more likely. And then you move to World War II, where sulfa drugs are available earlier in the war and penicillin arrives in 1944. Disease mortality drops sharply. The trend is clear. Disease accounted for a significantly smaller percentage of total casualties compared to World War I.
And then the Korean War is where it really bottoms out.
Right. The Korean War is described as the first war where antibiotics were available from start to finish, and disease mortality became a small fraction of total casualties. Combat injuries became the primary cause of death, not infection, not disease. Antibiotics are identified as the decisive factor in that transformation.
That's a profound shift. And it doesn't stay on the battlefield.
Not at all. The civilian population benefits enormously. Before antibiotics, bacterial infections were among the leading causes of death worldwide. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, septicemia, wound infections, these routinely killed children and adults alike. And then antibiotics arrive, and in developed countries, average lifespan roughly doubles, from around 40 years in the early 20th century to over 80 years today.
Doubled. That's not an incremental improvement. That's a complete restructuring of what human life looks like.
And the source material is careful to note that this reflects multiple factors: vaccines, sanitation, nutrition, medical technology, but antibiotics remain central. Childhood mortality plummeted. Surgery became safer because surgeons could perform complex procedures with dramatically reduced infection risk. Even agriculture changed. Penicillin and other antibiotics were used to promote livestock health, though that later raised serious concerns about resistance.
Which Fleming himself warned about, right? Almost immediately.
He did. Shortly after penicillin's introduction, resistant bacteria emerged. Fleming warned about antibiotic resistance early on. And today, antibiotic resistance is described as a major global health challenge. So even the miracle carries a shadow.
Okay, so here's where I want to pivot. Because the source material we're working from isn't just a history of penicillin. It's part of a much larger argument, a thesis about scientific history and social upheaval. And antibiotics are one piece of that puzzle. Can you set up the framework?
Yeah, so the author is making a sweeping argument. The thesis is that every time academia crosses what they call an epiphanic threshold, a moment of paradigm-shifting knowledge, cognitive dissonance among the intelligentsia results in social upheaval and attending human rights violations. And crucially, with each new epiphany, the severity of the resulting upheaval is amplified.
So it's like a ratchet. Each discovery doesn't just change things, it makes the next disruption worse.
That's exactly the metaphor the author uses, a ratcheting mechanism. And the author traces this through 13 epiphanic thresholds in human history, all stemming from a single invention, the optical lens, attributed to Ibn Sahl. From that one invention, you get Galileo's telescope, then Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, and the chain just keeps going.
And antibiotics, penicillin specifically, is one of those 13 thresholds.
It is. And the author frames it in this striking way. They say, all of the history they've traced is worth it, if only to arrive in a world where diseases can be cured before they even afflict their victims. So there's genuine gratitude for what antibiotics represent. But that gratitude is immediately complicated by the larger argument.
What's the complication?
The author says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that they cannot justify the carnage that accredited academia caused at the same time it was delivering these blessings. The argument is that the same intellectual culture that produced penicillin also failed catastrophically to challenge pseudoscience, specifically what the author calls socialist theory. And that failure, they argue, was criminally negligent.
That's a strong charge. Criminally negligent.
It is. And the author's specific claim is that there was a complete absence of a peer review process leading to World War I and World War II. The argument is that hypothesis was presented to the general public as science instead of mere hypothesis. And when that happens, with ideas about social organization, ideas about who deserves to live, who constitutes a class enemy, the consequences are catastrophic.
So the author is drawing a direct line from failures in peer review to the Holocaust.
A direct line. The author writes that the Holocaust should not be attributed to a furious, goose-stepping Nazi, but to a fatal flaw within accredited academia. And they describe a specific scene, the Café Central in Vienna in 1910, where Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, and others were meeting. The author describes them as having evolved into what they call the proletariat, defined by what was then accepted as science, but which the author argues was actually pseudoscience.
And on the periphery of that coffee klatch, according to the author, is a young Adolf Hitler.
Exactly. The author describes him as a loner at a table across the room, soaking it all in and beginning to make plans of his own. It's a vivid and deliberately unsettling image. The point being that the intellectual environment, the pseudoscientific ideas circulating in that cafe, created the conditions for what followed.
I want to push back on something here because I think a reasonable listener might say, isn't this too neat, blaming the Holocaust on academia rather than on the specific actors who carried it out?
That's a fair challenge, and I think the author anticipates it. The argument isn't that academia pulled the trigger, it's that academia failed to maintain the integrity of peer review, which allowed dangerous ideas to gain the legitimacy of science without actually being science. The author is very specific. When hypothesis is presented as established science, and no one in the intellectual establishment challenges it, you create a permission structure for atrocity.
And the author has a name for the psychological mechanism that makes that failure happen.
Idolatry. And this is one of the most interesting parts of the thesis. The author says that failures in peer review alone can't explain the dissonance at epiphanic moments. Idolatry is the only diagnosis that explains intellectual dissonance at these thresholds. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of Scripture than to manifest truth, that's idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that's also idolatry.
So it's not a religious critique specifically, it's a critique of anyone who prioritizes their belief system over evidence.
Right. And the author makes it universal, they say, since everyone is, in some measure, both theologian and scientist, we are all susceptible to idolatry. We believe what we believe for reasons we're convinced are justifiable. And when those justifications are exposed as fallacies, we're hard-pressed to abandon our beliefs because we define ourselves too much by what we believe.
That's actually a really uncomfortable observation, because it's not pointing at a villain, it's pointing at a universal human tendency.
And the author frames it as the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome. What every major religion instructs, and what peer review of science enforces, is that we are our own worst counsel. Accepting that is hard. But the author's argument is that failing to accept it has historically catastrophic consequences.
And the author connects this back to the present day with a warning.
A stark one. The author writes that when the next Holocaust occurs, it will not be because a furious man goose-stepped his way into power, but because the ivory tower refused to live by its own rules. The argument is that instead of reforming the peer review process and applying empirical standards to all existing theories, academia went on what the author calls a Nazi hunt, focusing on the symptom rather than the disease.
So the thesis is essentially that we learned the wrong lesson from the Holocaust.
That's a fair summary. We identified the monster and hunted him. We didn't fix the system that created the conditions for the monster to emerge. And the author argues that socialism is still regarded as a legitimate theory on social evolution, still taught, still debated, without the kind of rigorous peer review that would expose its, in the author's view, fatal flaws.
Now, I think it's worth noting that this is a provocative thesis. There are plenty of scholars who would push back hard on the idea that socialism as a theory is equivalent to pseudoscience, or that the Holocaust is primarily an academic failure rather than a political and moral one.
Absolutely. And the author isn't claiming to have the final word. This is framed as a series of essays, with a follow-up series promised. But what makes the argument interesting, regardless of where you land on it, is the framework itself. The idea that paradigm-shifting scientific discoveries don't just change medicine or technology, they destabilize entire worldviews. And that destabilization has political and social consequences that can be catastrophic if the intellectual establishment isn't rigorous.
And antibiotics sit right at the center of that argument, because the 1905 proof that diseases were not punishments from God, but biological consequences of pathogens, the author marks that as the moment the divorce between religion and science became final.
Yes, and the author says at that juncture, there was no way to stop the Holocaust. From 1905 forward, science would reign supreme among the world's intelligentsia. But the few who were following empirical method were outpaced by those who published pseudoscience in what the author calls an orgy of intellectual ambition. That's a vivid phrase.
It really is. And it reframes the entire history of penicillin. It's not just a story about a mold and a petri dish. It's a story about what happens when human knowledge outpaces human wisdom.
That's exactly the tension the author is sitting with. They express genuine gratitude. They say they could not be more grateful for all the blessings accredited academia delivered in the last century, but they cannot justify the carnage that came alongside those blessings. And they argue those two things are not separate stories. They're the same story.
Which brings us back to that hospital ship off Normandy, because in a way, that ship holds both sides of the argument simultaneously.
It does. The penicillin on that ship is the product of everything science can achieve at its best. Fleming's observation, the Oxford team's rigor, the industrial scale-up, the wartime urgency. And the war itself, the reason those men needed saving, is, in the author's framework, partly the product of what science produces at its worst. Unchecked ideas, unreviewed theories, intellectual idolatry.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, here's what this really comes down to. Antibiotics are one of the most consequential scientific breakthroughs in human history. That's not hyperbole, that's the record. Fleming's accidental observation in 1928, the Oxford team's purification work, the Cold Spring Harbor mutation experiments, 2 million doses by D-Day, disease mortality collapsing across 3 wars, life expectancy doubling. That's a real, documented transformation of human life.
And the author honors that, genuinely. But the thesis asks us to hold that achievement alongside a harder question. What does it mean that the same intellectual culture capable of producing penicillin was also capable of producing the conditions for the Holocaust? And the answer the author offers is that it's not a contradiction, it's a pattern. Every epiphanic threshold in history has produced both a gift and a disruption. And the disruption grows worse each time because the intellectual establishment keeps failing to police itself.
And the mechanism the author identifies, idolatry, the devotion to one's own beliefs over manifest truth, that's not a historical problem. That's a present tense problem.
Very much so. The author's warning is forward-looking. The next catastrophe, they argue, won't announce itself with a goose step. It'll arrive dressed in the language of science, unchallenged by peer review, and by the time the dissonance becomes visible, the march will already be nearly complete.
That's a genuinely unsettling thought to sit with, and I think it's the right place to land, because it connects the very concrete, a drug, a ship, a beach in Normandy, to something much larger about how knowledge moves through history and what we do with it.
And what we fail to do with it. The actionable insight here, if there is one, is that rigor matters. Peer review matters. The difference between a hypothesis and an established fact matters enormously, not just in a laboratory, but in a society. Because when we stop making that distinction, the consequences don't stay in the ivory tower.
They end up on a hospital ship.
Or worse, they create the war that makes the hospital ship necessary.
That's the full circle right there. We started with penicillin saving lives off the coast of Normandy, and we end with the argument that the intellectual failures which made that war possible and the scientific rigor that produced the cure to survive it are two sides of the same coin. The mold that Fleming noticed on a contaminated plate in 1928 didn't just change medicine. According to this thesis, it's one gear in a machine that's been turning since Ibn Sahl ground his first lens, and it's still turning.